and I am happy to receive here, Jon Ingold. He is the writer director. I'm not sure what the whole scope of responsibilities that you actually have, but yeah, he's basically a writer, and we invited him specifically because of Heaven's Vault, this game that I hope most of you at least play in the future. And the game is actually very relevant for archaeology because it is starring a female archaeologist, and actually captures a lot of aspects of archaeology and archaeological work, at least in my opinion, and might not capture another other aspects. So that actually will be an interesting thing to discuss here. And yeah, sorry about taking so much delay. And I present you Jon Ingold. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much for turning up. So as Andreas says, my name is Jon Ingold. I'm the narrative director at Inkle. So just to let you know what that means, Inkle is tiny. We were originally 2 people. We're now 4. At the height of work on Heaven's Vault, we were 8. So that's the kind of scale that we're talking about. I wrote Heaven's Vault, did all of the kind of story design for it, which means the normal business of writing, so working out characters and plot lines and who killed whom with what, that kind of stuff, but also the technical design of the writing. So how does the game deliver story? How does the player discover story in the game? How does the player influence story? And all of those questions that arise from it being an interactive story rather than a fixed linear one that you might encounter in a book or a film. In a tiny studio, you also end up doing lots of other things. So I did some coding. I designed some of the game mechanics in the game, which I'll probably outline as I go, and testing and some production and that kind of thing. But broadly, I think of myself as a writer. That's what I am first and foremost. Is I want to have writer on my tombstone. I don't want producer or coder on my tombstone. Thank you very much. That said, I have a maths degree, so I am my own worst enemy. Right, so the game is Heaven's Vault, and for those of you who haven't played it, it is a science fiction archaeological adventure, and we marketed it as kind of explore this unknown world and decipher an ancient hieroglyphic language as you go. That's the idea. That's the sort of the pitch for the game. Where we actually started when we were building it was the simple idea of space archaeology. We thought archaeology would be a good activity for a game, and we thought that if we set it on Earth, then everyone who played the game would say, oh, we already know the Romans, we already know the Egyptians, we already know the ancient Chinese. Whether or not they actually do is irrelevant. They would assume that they did, and then they wouldn't engage with it. So we thought if we put it in a space sci-fi setting, then people would approach it with a sense of wonder and curiosity, which we felt was important to making it feel interesting, I guess, as a place to start. But I guess the first question behind that really is why archaeology in the first place? And that comes from the first sort of thing that I wanted to talk about in kind of thinking through how we did the project and how we came to it. I have no personal connection with archaeology. I have a little tangential connection with anthropology, which I will get out of the way, which is that my father is a relatively famous anthropologist. So I was brought up in a kind of something of an anthropological mindset, and a lot of those ideas are familiar. But I also, being the son of an anthropologist, paid very little attention to what my father did, and never really asked him about it, as all good sons should ignore the work of their fathers. That's very important. So as I did. So I have a kind of tangential relationship with that, but not a kind of not a deep personal connection. So I wasn't driven by a passion to communicate archaeological ideas or burdened with a responsibility to do it well, particularly, any more than a writer has that responsibility regardless of what they're talking about. It wasn't a precious subject matter to me. So where we really started from was the business of making an interactive narrative. That's the company that I co-run. That's kind of what we were founded to do. That's what we decided we wanted to try and do, was make stories where players can be engaged. And what that really means is making activities for the player to do within a digital environment, within a simulated environment. And so we came to archaeology as really that it sounded like an interesting activity for a player to do. And I think that's really important for understanding why Heaven's Vault has been kind of embraced by archaeologists, because we approached archaeology as an activity, not as a skin or a setting or a tone or an aesthetic. So if you look at other representations of archaeology in media, it seems to me that a lot of them are not really concerned with archaeology as an activity at all. You know, Indiana Jones is basically a spy, as far as I can tell, though he claims to do some archaeology. Lara Croft is a thief cat burglar who claims to do some archaeology. But they don't do archaeology. Archaeology is kind of hung on them to justify the thing that they actually do. But we started with this idea that archaeology was an interesting activity in and of itself that we could get the player to do somehow and engage with somehow. And that essentially, in a nutshell, is the entirety of why Heaven's Vault has ended up quite different from other representations of archaeology, and also why it was such a goddamn nightmare to actually make. Because having decided this and committed to this, we were then faced with this terrible question, which I realized was much harder than I had originally realized, which is, what on earth do archaeologists actually do? And what is archaeology as an activity? And of course, there are no representations in modern fiction that actually told me what archaeologists did, even slightly. So we had to kind of start from the beginning on that. So I'll kind of take you through the process and what we discovered along the way and what we thought about, because I think it's interesting. So we started with a very kind of basic, essentially a brainstorm, really, of kind of, well, okay, what are the sort of things that archaeologists do that we might be able to give to a player to do to make them feel like they're being archaeologists and thereby engage with this activity of archaeology? And the first things that you think of are brushing away dirt from small trenches, and you think about piecing jigsaw puzzles of pots back together. Like, you think of those things straight away. And it's pretty clear that they are both activities that one could put in a computer game and make players do, and they would both be excruciatingly awful and incredibly boring, as they probably are in real archaeology. I've never done either of those things, but I can't imagine that they're massively engaging 6, 7, 8 hours in. Who can say? But that was quite good, because that meant we could get rid of those ideas quite quickly and think a bit more broadly about what's the appeal of the idea of archaeology. Why did we come up with this idea in the first place? What was it that we were kind of reaching for? And the three things that we ended up on were not really in any particular order. Was the first was deciphering text, deciphering script, deciphering lost languages. That's immediately romantic. It appeals to me as a writer designer because it's a thing that the player can do, but it has an inherently narrative core. When you're reading something that someone has written, you're solving the problem of how to read it, but what you're getting from that is a direct voice from the past of a person talking about a thing and a context. And that to me was incredibly exciting, because it was a way of making something that was mechanically gameplay, but felt conceptually meaningful, felt like it had depth and richness behind it, which is really rare in computer games, actually. Most games are like, you know, you shoot the person and they die and let's try not to think about it too much. That's your kind of baseline computer game interaction. So having something where you decipher a text and come to understand what somebody was thinking, that was very exciting. So that I think was as soon as we saw that kind of made us think, oh yeah, okay, there's something here. The second thing that we liked was the idea of locating lost sites, which is probably actually in the final game the weakest part of the game. We never quite nailed that into the way that we would have liked, but that is very much a romantic ideal to me. I'm not sure it has very much to do with real archaeology. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I was very much driven by a memory of a description of how Heinrich Schliemann claims to have found Troy, which I think I studied when I was 16 at high school, where he asserts, if I remember correctly, he asserts that he read a passage of Homer which describes a hill, walked up a hill, stuck his spade in the ground and said, this is where Troy must be, dug it and found it, which is one of those descriptions which is absolutely fascinating and brilliant, and almost certainly a complete lie from beginning to end. Because, you know, the odds are very much against it. But we like that idea of kind of being the Sherlock Holmes genius who can just shove their post in the ground and say, this is it, this is where you need to dig, and there's something there, that kind of X marks the spot thing. And then the third thing which turned out, I think, to be the bulk of the game, really, is inference and analysis. An archaeologist, as far as I can make out, is somebody who pieces pots back together and digs up mosaics from underground and all that kind of stuff. But then they don't just take the object and dump it on a table and walk away. They then have to have a conversation with someone about what on earth this object was. And that's really interesting from a game design point of view, from an activity point of view, for a whole bunch of reasons. That's really, really, really exciting for me, and was really exciting for me, that because it flies in the face of everything that computer games normally do, and that games in general expect of their players. When people approach computer games, they are always optimizing things and solving things. That's what games are about. They're about doing it better, more efficiently. They're doing it faster. They're doing it more better than the next person. There's this whole kind of competitive free market nonsense that goes on in the kind of game design, gameplay head. It's all very, I said I have a master's degree, it's all very game theoretic. And finding solutions to puzzles. And the deal with a puzzle, right, is that there's always a solution, there's one of them, and you can always get to it. That anything else is not categorized as a puzzle. But what I liked about the idea of finding archaeological evidence, whether it's a site or an artifact, and then having to infer things about it, is that it's wonderfully, it wonderfully undermines and deconstructs those basic assumptions of gameplay, because it is something you can engage with. It is an activity. You can play at trying to figure out what this site was. I know we can, because we built a game about that. And there is a correct answer. There is a solution. It is essentially a puzzle. When you dig a little hooked piece of metal out of the ground, well, somebody did use it for something, but you're going to have to guess, and you can never verify your answer. And that idea of a puzzle that has got a solution, so it's not like analyzing a literary text where the author's intentions may never have been formulated or really existed at all. There is definitely a thing that somebody did with this hooked bit of metal, but you can't ever ask them what it was. So fundamentally, your guess is only as good as it is, and it can be overturned next week and next year, and it can be entirely contextual. And that's wonderful to me, because that puts a tension which can never be resolved onto the player, but in a way that feels fair. When you present someone with a Sudoku which can't be solved, then players quite rightly say, well, I'm not sure what the point of that is, because why should I bother engaging with it when I can't solve it, even if you claim that there is a solution? But it isn't like that. It's a problem which they feel that, I don't know, morally maybe they ought to be able to solve it, but they can't. And that gap between believing that you've understood what a site is, or understood what an artifact was, or understood the progression of events in our game world, and actually being certain that you have, makes for a really compelling gap and a really compelling tension. And I think that's really where the heart and soul of Heaven's Vault is. So we ended up with these three core mechanics, basically, that we described as exploration, conversation, and translation. So exploration is discovering places to go and finding things within sites, and that's pretty standard games, actually. Games are constantly doing exploration. They love 3D space. That it's not massively interesting, I think, but it's fine, it's solid. Translation, which was our mechanic for uncovering and kind of coming to understand this ancient language. And then conversation, or kind of analysis, which is the majority of what you're doing when you're not doing translation. You're walking around, and you and your sidekick character are swapping theories about what it is that you've found. And a lot of the choices presented to the player are basically, the character will say, I'm pretty sure this location must be, and then up will come a choice that says a theatre, a ritual site, a sports ground, whatever, and you pick one, with the joke being that whatever you pick, your character will then come to believe permanently until she finds something which proves that that theory is wrong. So your random, or rather your educated guess early on in the game, can be influencing your character's thoughts way later into the game, despite the fact that they weren't based on very much evidence at all, which is probably really true, right? Like if you go to a culture that you know nothing about and find artifacts from that culture, you start making guesses about that culture based on your preconceptions, and there's no other way you can do it. So that was a kind of a core a core thing that we found falling out of our idea of what the activity for the player might be. And the more that we discovered that we could make the conversations branch, and we could make them ambiguous, and we could make the player, that we could take the player's theories and then use them against the player, so that they would come up with an idea, and then we would put that idea back into the conversation and make them develop it further, make them kind of fit evidence together in more and complex ways without knowing if they were on the right lines or not. We found that as designers and as writers, that was just really interesting and engaging and entertaining, because you could lead people at all sorts of blind alleys, and they couldn't really believe that you'd done all this work creating conversations about something which wasn't true, but on the other hand, they couldn't be certain that you hadn't. And that gave us a kind of lovely space to fill the game out with. Technically, that was incredibly difficult, because it meant that we had to really, the game tracks what the player knows and what the player believes about pretty much everything in the whole game all the time, and that drives what the characters say to each other, which I don't think I've ever seen a game that attempts that kind of modeling of player knowledge on the scale that we did, and it seemed to just about hold up, which was nice. I think but I think I've lost my thread. But I think the thing that kind of, so we were kind of tracking what the player knew to try and get them to engage with their own theories and maybe contradict their own theories as they went along, and kind of do that conversationally. Oh yeah, the other thing I was just going to say is on kind of the aspect of making it into a puzzle. One thing we did up front was we built, for our game world is called the Nebula, and for it we kind of laid out 5,000 years worth of history, roughly. Like, it has sort of 5 ages, and we know who the major figures were and how the political situation changed and the sociology changed and that kind of thing. And just so that there was something that you could discover, and we knew for certain what it was. And then we built as many alternative theories and as many broken histories as we possibly could, to make the player go the wrong way. And ideally, what we wanted was the player to end the game with a timeline. The game fills in a timeline as you make theories and discoveries, which you can review. And we wanted that timeline to end up full of contradictions that you couldn't resolve. We wanted it to have events which were clearly in the wrong order, but which you couldn't necessarily sort out using the game's interface. We wanted people to have to take their interpretation out of the game and into their head if they actually wanted to sort it out. And that was really entertaining as a goal. It didn't necessarily pan out once the game came to be reviewed. It was definitely clear that some players just didn't understand what we were doing with that, and they kind of said, well, look, this just doesn't make sense, or it's buggy, or it's broken, when actually we just wanted them to think, maybe. But you know, you can ask too much sometimes. And then the third pillar of the game was the kind of deciphering translation mechanic of the game, which I think is the one that everyone who reviewed and talked about the game really kind of focused on. I think because it was quite unusual and quite different, and it sort of worked as well. And the idea is, if you haven't played it, but it presents you with inscriptions written in this kind of symbolic language. It's not a real language in that it has no phonetic structure at all. Everything is assembled from logical concepts glued together, because that makes for better gameplay. That makes for gameplay you can engage with, because you can start to think, well, what does this symbol mean? And have I seen it in this context and this context, without having to understand how it was said. And then the interface allows you to basically guess translations for each collection of symbols. And then whatever guess you make, you're kind of stuck with until you change your mind about it later. And that's the kind of core idea of it, is that it's built on translating inscriptions that you find around the world by guessing what they say. And your guesswork might be based on what the symbols look like, or where you've seen them before, or it might be based on the context and the artifact itself. So if this is a brooch, then perhaps it's something about being decorative. And if this is a wall, then perhaps it's about something about what this wall contains. And you take your theory about the fact that you think this is a temple and you insert it into the translations and end up kind of creating your own self-fulfilling description of what the world is. And at its best, the translation mechanic offers you the ability to double down on a wrong theory with great confidence. And I think when it does that, it feels really lovely. And as you go through the game, though, because it is a game and we do need to keep people on track, we do need to keep people getting a sense of progress and a sense that they are winning, they are getting somewhere. And of course, because it's a game, there isn't any other context. If you're a real Egyptologist cracking real hieroglyphics, there's a huge amount of extra context you can bring in to help understand things. Obviously, in a game, you get what we give you and nothing else. So the mechanic is fairly carefully balanced to make sure that it sometimes tells you that you've got a word right, and it sometimes tells you that you've got a word wrong. But the one red line that we had is it never tells you what a particular component symbol means, even though each of those does have a meaning. So again, it's that idea that there is a puzzle, there is a unique and accurate solution to it. It is technically something you could figure out, but we are never going to tell you that you have. And we're never going to give you the ability to draw a line under it and say, yeah, I've completed this. I've totally solved it. And we've been seeing that playing out ever since we released it. We have a little chat community server thing on a channel called Discord, which has a couple of hundred people in it. And there are people there still debating, discussing, and translating inscriptions from the game and kind of finding little bits of language that we put on marketing materials or that we put on posters, or that there's one at the bottom of the credits page of the game, which you can't do via the game interface. So you have to approach it as an inscription and try to solve it based on what you know. And they debate what this might mean. And they say, oh, well, I think it's a bit more like this. And given the context, it's a bit more like that. And those discussions are kind of wonderfully live because everybody engaging with it knows that there is a right answer, but nobody has the authority to say this is definitively correct. And so that means that the conversation kind of never ends. No one ever gets to win it. And that, I think, is interesting because we've sort of created something which looks to me a lot like the academic discourse around translating or understanding an artifact, in that it's an ongoing process of debate that probably recovers the same ground quite a lot, but some things get established as a convention or a rule and become common knowledge. But within this entirely fictional environment. And I think the reason that we've managed to do that when I don't know any other games that ever have is precisely because we embraced this idea of ambiguity really early on. This idea that that we weren't ever going to allow you to solve anything, because we were more interested in what you thought about it and how you analyzed it and how you debated it, and how you played with your own ideas than we were about understanding the history of this made-up place that we'd made up anyway. Because ultimately, who cares what the history of the nebula is? I invented it over the course of a few years to fill out a PlayStation game. It's not important. What's important is the process of building and taking apart and putting back together your ideas and seeing that one can do that pretty much endlessly. And that we felt was really instructive and really enjoyable and really different. And I feel like there's a whole world of games that one could make sort of following on from that idea of just treating ambiguity with respect, which most games don't, because they're so busy making sure that everyone feels that they've won by the end and that they've got everything right. And I don't know that it's what we're going to tackle next exactly, but it's interesting. It's interesting to see it as a space and to find a balance that works on it. The only other thing I kind of wanted to think about really was what we thought about archaeology more broadly in terms of the narrative. I think I started off saying, we asked ourselves this question of what is it that archaeologists do, and then after a while, having got our design down and worked out what our mechanics were and worked out what we thought the player could do moment to moment as they went through this world, we wanted there to be some kind of narrative around it. We wanted the player to go through some events and come to some realizations and have some kind of impact on the world, which led us to another question, which I think was even harder, which was, what are archaeologists even for? Which is one I still haven't solved to my satisfaction. I came up with some ideas and I put them into my game, but and that's okay. I don't, I have trouble enough solving my own existential crises. I don't need to be responsible for your existential crises as well. But it was kind of interesting engaging with it as a question, because I think one starts off with this sense of, well, archaeologists are important because they preserve the past, but of course then you think, well, why do we need to do that? And the only voice that I had in my head when I started this project was Indiana Jones saying this belongs in a museum, and it gave me a great amount of respect for that line in that film, because it entirely justifies everything that the character does for the next 8 hours of filmmaking succinctly, despite not making any sense whatsoever. It's delivered with such aplomb, it just nails it and makes the problem go away. So we had an option of starting Heaven's Vault with our character just asserting to camera that the objects belonged in a museum and that was why we were doing what we were doing. But we felt pretty immediately that's not the right answer, that's definitely wrong. The objects do not necessarily belong in museums. Who gets to have the museum anyway? What is this idea that you can just go and steal things and put them in a glass case somewhere else? And that whole thing seemed to me to be terribly colonial and playing into the kind of trope of archaeology that you see in Agatha Christie books of kind of, well, really it's really a kind of about gentlemen thieves going on holiday and stealing nice bits of art. It's not, that's the focus of kind of the archaeology of Heinrich Schliemann, as far as I can tell anyway. Not the kind of historical stuff is ancillary to that. It's like the rich person wants the stuff and hires an academic, and the academic gets excited about the history and he's suffered. We don't mind him. But, you know, if this is an Agatha Christie story, the academic is the first or second person to die, because we don't want him by the end of the story. So that kind of left us floundering slightly in terms of what do we do with our narrative? How do we make archaeology feel like something that the reader, the player wants to champion, that is a force, an important force? And when I was trying to read around that and trying to kind of understand that beyond a sense of just, you know, isn't it cool to understand how they built Stonehenge? Yeah, fine. Okay, it's cool, but what's the point? I came across the work of a lady called Dr. Monica Hanna, who's an Egyptian Egyptologist who works kind of on the preservation of artifacts and Egyptian history, but with a particular angle against the looting of Egyptian artifacts by Egyptian people themselves, and the kind of gap between the sense of ancient Egypt and the sense of modern Egypt being the same country and basically the same people. And I'm not really qualified to analyze this material in any great depth, I don't think, but I found it really interesting and really it really turned a light on for me, this idea that the past and what archaeologists do is important because it gives us a narrative and a story which we use, which provides power to somebody in the present and is used to justify things in the present. And we have archaeologists in modern society, and they act as a kind of myth maker, but one with a scientific grounding. And because they have a scientific grounding, we believe what they say. If we were to listen to kind of ancient Viking tales about Yggdrasil, the world tree, we don't believe that. It's just a story. But if we find a Viking burial ground, or we find a buried longboat with stuff in it, we believe it because it's physical and it's tangible, and we like that kind of thing. And then we make deductions from that. As a society, we think, oh yeah, the Vikings were tough and strong and they were great fighters, and everybody in the country knows what a Viking is like, but not that many people in the country know about Yggdrasil, the world tree. And that's something in the way that we tell stories about ourselves, and that seemed to me to be incredibly important. So what Heaven's Vault tries to do with its narrative is it starts in a world in which there is a predominant narrative about the world and about where it came from and who's in power and why they're in power, and it's almost entirely wrong. Absolutely everything in it has been adjusted and altered and influenced by key figures in the past for deliberate, considered reasons and convenient reasons. And a lot of what the player is doing is discovering piece by piece by piece every single one of these narratives and why it was changed and how it was changed, but they're doing it in a way that's grounded in some kind of evidence or some kind of artifact. You know, there's a lot of, well, this site shouldn't be here because everything I've understood about the world says that this didn't exist, and yet here it is. And that process of taking apart the assumptions that we have about the world because we can see that the past was not how it was supposed to be, that seemed to me to be important, and it bears repeating. And we do it maybe 5 or 6 times across the course of one game of Heaven's Vault. Obviously we leave you with lots of questions at the end. But you can just keep doing it. Yeah, as a thing, you can just keep doing it. And I think, and it feels very applicable to the modern world, and it feels very applicable to kind of trying to understand what the hell is going on with politics at the moment, and trying to understand the way that people talk about, you know, whether it's Brexit or whether it's Trump's thing in America. You know, all of that stuff is based on the stories that people tell about themselves and the assumptions that they haven't noticed that they've got. And that, to me, seemed to be vital and basically drove the kind of narrative development across the game for 4 years. You know, it was the rocket underneath the narrative. And I think the idea of putting an archaeologist at the heart of that gave that strength, that if it had been a journalist or an investigative, you know, a detective or something. And so I think kind of that's a much more standard game narrative, right? You have your detective uncovering the truth about the city. It doesn't have quite the same weight to it. A detective can uncover some nasty little scandal about the mayor, but they can't tell you that your whole city's power structure is wrong. But an archaeologist really can, actually. And I thought that was kind of gripping, and I really, really liked that. So that became my answer of what are archaeologists for, is that they're myth makers we're capable of believing in. And that's Heaven's Vault. It's also a silly game about a robot, and about robots and stuff like that, because, you know, whatever. But yeah, that was kind of how I came to it. And I think yeah, I think that's everything I have to say. Yeah, Indiana Jones is a treasure hunter, Mark. Yeah, I think he isn't even, actually. I think he's a crusader. I quite like Indiana Jones, and I think one of the reasons I do is that it's a film about somebody who's lost their faith, regaining their faith. And all of the archaeology and all of the treasure and antiquity stuff is completely irrelevant. It's really just, it's a moral story. I remember noticing that and thinking that was no use to us at all, because players of computer games are never, ever moral. They just don't think that way. So you can't really tell them moral stories. Okay, I hope that was interesting. I've taken a good length of time as well. So I'll answer any questions if people have questions, or apologize for anything that I've got massively wrong, or anything that seems appropriate.
Well, I think we can do the questions in the chat, or...
Can I ask a long one?
Yeah,
okay,
go ahead.
Yeah. I couldn't really, so I really like your game. It's one of my favorites. And I have several questions, but the one that I was most interested in, like, getting your thoughts on is, like, I was really intrigued by how you conceptualized how the people of Ios thought about the past, and how, like, it didn't exist, and compared with that, like, archaeology wasn't worthwhile for exploring, and, like, why you made that choice to have that. Like, I get it as a way of covering up things, but yeah.
So there's a little bit more to that decision than just kind of, it's a convenient way to make sure that nobody in the world knows anything about the past, though it does definitely serve that function. When you start a computer game, you always have this problem that the player knows absolutely nothing and the character knows at least something. They should know, you know, where their house is, or kind of what their telephone number is, and the player really doesn't know any of these things. So it's quite common in games to have narrative tricks to help the player and the protagonist get a little bit closer into line in terms of their understanding. And the belief on Iox, for those who haven't played, Iox is kind of the most powerful planet. It's the university planet, because universities are evil, right? And the university planet has this belief that history is a loop, that everything that happens will happen again. And I'll talk a bit more about what that means in just a moment. But so that means that the player starts off as this archaeologist who has suffered, because most people don't think there is any point in archaeology, because the past is irrelevant, because it's just going to happen again and everything's in a status quo. So nothing will change. So why do you dig anything up? So it kind of originated as an idea from my understanding that I'm pretty sure I read somewhere one time, and I can't remember where, and I don't even know if it's true, but I choose to believe that it's true, that in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, but probably the Dark Ages, it was common for people to believe that history was a repeating cycle, because they didn't really have any sense of history progressing, because there wasn't any written records and everything was cyclical anyway, like seasons and years and stuff. So people just didn't generally, they believed that history was a loop there. I remember reading this somewhere, and I thought it was a cool idea. The reason that it turns up in Heaven's Vault for me is that if you want to, it's about the use of that for power, right? So IOX wants to tell the world that not only are they in charge, of course they are in charge. There's no one is allowed to question that they're in charge. And by saying that, well, everything that happened in the past is going to happen in the future, then everyone who's in charge now needs to be in charge and should be in charge and therefore is in charge. And to me, that's just a reflection of the British class system that I've grown up underneath. There's a group of people who are in charge, and they're not in charge for any reason apart from the fact that they're in charge. And to question that is sheer madness. Should anyone ask for just a second what these people have actually achieved, or in what sense are they qualified to take any of the decisions they take, that question doesn't even make any sense to us. We can't begin to ask the question of what aptitude has Mr. Johnson shown for the role that he's taking at the moment, because he's the person in charge, so that's why he's in charge. He always was, he always will be. And I felt like that was just so, as a science fiction concept, it's quite tight, it's quite alluring. As a gameplay tweak to make sure that the player is roughly in the right starting place, it works very neatly. As a religion, and they treat it as a religion, it has that nice tone of being sort of, you can see why it's comforting, and so people would like to believe that everything is how it's supposed to be, but it's also really bonkers. And when you encounter a fictional religion that just feels bonkers, that's really helpful. I think that's really nice, and it makes it feel like a religion, because religions, when you're not in them, always appear bonkers to people outside them. And I think that's a great thing to highlight without actually like attacking any individual religion for being bonkers, because they all are, unless you're in them, in which case they're true. So, there's nothing to attack. So a lot of things converge for me about that idea, but really it was a description of, it was an efficient way to demonstrate why Ioxians are so cruel without being horrible people. It's because they don't have any choice, because they just are who they are. One thing that's interesting about the knowledge gap between the player and the protagonist, actually, which I think I might mention, is when you finish a run of Heaven's Vault, a lot of the story is assembled based on what you do and what you happen to decide and choose. And that means that every playthrough of it is a little bit different, which is very unusual for an adventure game, for a narrative game. And we wanted to encourage people to replay the game and explore it a different way and see that we'd done this work. And the way that we did that was, at the end of the game, you've assembled some kind of dictionary of ancient words, and then when you restart the game, it keeps that dictionary. So you start the game with it, and then every inscription that you find, every translation that you do, is significantly longer and more complicated than you originally saw. So you might find the same artifact, but instead of having 2 words written on it, it's got 7 words written on it, or 15 words written on it. So that the game could be played kind of 8 or 9 times and continually levels itself up. And what I like about that is that when you start your first new game, you're much closer to being who the protagonist in the game actually is. Like in your first playthrough of the game, you encounter this first translation which has 1 word in it, and she goes, "Oh, I don't know what it is." And a few reviewers said, this lady's supposed to be like the best archaeologist in the entire of this universe, who's been studying this language forever, and she can't read she can't read this. This is rubbish. Whereas on your second playthrough, you're much closer to a plausible starting position for this archaeologist, which I quite liked, and was another affordance of the loop concept that we kind of built that in. How seriously or not to take that loop, I'm not sure, but it was a nice little affordance. Anybody else?
If nobody has a question, I do have a question. Maybe it relates a little bit with that one. And spoiler alert, maybe we shouldn't talk too much about the details, but I do like the fact that there is this kind of moral ambiguity surrounding the protagonist, and what she actually do during, and what she actually can do. So what she actually says to the robot, or and like people in IOX, for example, you have this kind of relationship that at first you get the feeling that maybe the others are the good guys and you are like just a crappy people, so not really like a good person, and then you get like this kind of feeling that maybe it's the opposite, and you get constantly this kind of renewal of positions, no, like, and gives this kind of tint of reality to the story. And there is one point exactly that I feel that it presses a important button for archaeologists, and especially for the history of archaeology, is the fact that she actually has to deal with antiquarian merchant, no, at some point, and you can actually choose to like sell it, or like an artifact, or just bring it to the museum, and you have like different repercussions for that. So I thought really that part of the game is actually very interesting for an archaeologist, because it's a decision that, as you said, is something that is quite critical, and it doesn't feel that it has a real like correct answer, because at the end, if you do one thing, you are losing information. If you do the other, you are like collaborating with the power. And this is kind of, yeah. Sorry.
No, that was definitely something I was really. It was an interesting one. I was really keen to get in that sense that that once you've found an artifact that's intrinsically valuable, you know, how much responsibility do you have to this object that you've found? What responsibilities do you have? And I mean, some of what Heaven's Vault does with that is I think is really, I think, a joke, actually. Which, let me explain what I mean by that. So one of the default things you can do is you collect these artifacts and you go back to the university on IOX, and there's a librarian character, and he'll say, you know, have you found anything? And you can give him the artifacts you found, and he'll say, oh, brilliant, we'll put that in the museum. You know, this, he literally probably says, this belongs in a museum. And one of the reasons that I felt that was really important to have is that giving things to the curator gives you, the player, absolutely nothing. It gives you no gameplay benefit whatsoever. It doesn't really lose you anything, because obviously Aaliyah finds an artifact, writes down everything she needs to know about it, keeps that record, and then the artifact itself is kind of done. There's nothing else she can get from it. That's probably not entirely true in the real world, but there we go. But I like the idea that I felt that players would probably feel that they were supposed to give things to this guy, and they were supposed to put things in the museum because things belong in museums, right? That's this thing. And then to slowly maybe start to notice that they had no idea where these things were going, or what they were achieving, or what the point of it was. And I love that sense of growing uncertainty, especially when you give that to game players who naturally are optimizers, and they start saying, oh, it's pointless giving them to this guy. And I think, well, yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting thing. What are we doing this for? And then the other aspect that I really wanted to kind of, I wouldn't even say we explored it, but just play with in a kind of safe environment, is the fact that artifacts are intrinsically precious just because they're rare, which is something that I got from reading what I read of Dr. Hannah's work about Egyptology, and kind of the stealing of artifacts by Egyptians, and the kind of stealing and selling your own heritage because it's there right now and it matters right now. And it's one of the way that artifacts have power, is that they're valuable. And so is it okay to sell an artifact if it helps you to find another artifact? Does it really matter? If you've got 10 of these bloody brooches, does it matter if you sell 2 of them? In the Nebula, there is no currency for various narrative reasons. So everything is bartered. So is it okay to barter things? But then about halfway through the game, the player is kind of used to this model of barter. And so they're casually bartering some, and then there'll be a few rare artifacts, like you can find like the crown of the emperors. And that's obviously extremely rare. And I don't think many people choose to sell that one because they're worried that they really shouldn't. But there's a sliding scale, right? Because some of the artifacts are just like a carved brass doorknob, that kind of thing. And they look very commonplace, and there's about 200 of them, in the way that when you go to an archaeological museum, they have that drawer that you pull out, which is like keys or belt buckles. And there's just 200 million of them. And it's very hard to argue that if this could buy you a parking ticket, and you've got 199 more of them. Is that really the wrong thing to do? And that's interesting, I think. And it's great to put players in that position and make them actually do it. And even better when there are no repercussions. Nobody is watching them when they sell an artifact to the dodgy trader guy, apart from the trader guy who's quite happy and is your friend. Like, there is no police, there is no like accountancy, there is no accountability. It's extremely easy to pocket an ancient ring pulled out of an Egyptian tomb if nobody's watching you when you pick it up. And that's real, that's reality, right? So your moral code is yours, and you don't even have to tell anyone if you don't want to. And I thought all of that was a really interesting thing to put in front of the player in a kind of non-guided, non-judgmental way. It'd be very easy to make a game where you sell the artifacts and then at some point the SWAT team descends on you and says, oh, you're a bad person. But like, that's not how the world works, and it shouldn't be how the world works. And I love that there's some people who kind of played these sections of the game and then had this real sense of, I don't know if what I'm doing is wrong. And you kind of say, well, like, are you waiting for the game to tell you whether something is wrong or not? Is that not your job, like, as a human being? You know, like, what? That doesn't make any sense. And I think that's really, I really like that. And it fits very well with the theme of the game, the general theme of kind of ambiguity and uncertainty. And we're really not going to give you any answers, that you create a space in which you can do bad stuff, but we don't even notice that you're doing it necessarily. And like, you flip over to the other side of the game playing pond and you have games like Grand Theft Auto, which is a game about crime, right? It's a game about stealing cars that's named after stealing cars. And if you steal too many cars, you get a little star rating in the corner that says the police are after you, and then you have to run away until the police stop looking for you. Like, the game about stealing cars is really quite keen to tell you that it's wrong to steal cars. It wants to underline that point, even though that's what the game is called. It's not a game. I mean, that doesn't reflect the truth of stealing cars. People who steal cars are very good at stealing cars, and they never get chased by the police, and they never get caught. Your car never gets found. They just take the car and they're gone. But that's too scary. Grand Theft Auto can't do that. It can't make a world in which stealing cars is consequence-free. I mean, it sort of does, but it sort of can't quite. It doesn't feel okay doing that. And that's amazing, because they're like the least moral people in the games industry by some margin. So I thought that was all quite interesting, really, to sort of, to mess around with. Like, I'm not even sure I know what I think particularly. It's very easy to say, you know, I've done talks where I've said, oh, kind of archaeologists are thieves. Like, they go around stealing things. They should give the Easter Island statues back, blah, blah, blah. It's very easy for me to say this because I don't have to actually interface with that problem in reality. And it makes for a nice soundbite. The truth is, I think it's interesting to write about it and to see where it can take you, and to set up things for the player to be engaged with, and then just to let people experience them and see what they make of it. I'm not sure that I'm not the right person to answer any of those questions. To everyone in meeting, right? That's the Discord channel. So that's the place where people come and chat about Heaven's Vault and other stuff. I think there were some other questions. So shall I dig through? Where are we? Unrelated questions. I was interested by the depiction of a character with breathing issues. What was the choice to depict Aaliyah in this way? So, right, Aaliyah has a degenerative illness that means that she can't always breathe properly, and she gets out of breath when she does lots of physical exertion. That was originally going to be a very important key mechanic to stop people farming the entire of an environment. Our worry was that if you put people in a wide location, then because they're computer game players, they act like those robotic vacuum cleaners that go into every single corner of a room, and that they'll just go over the entire map picking everything up, and it's tedious and it's boring, and then when you've done all of this bit you have to trek all the way over there to get that bit, and you feel you have to because otherwise you're missing something, but it's not actually interesting. And we'd rather that people found some things and left some other things behind and dealt with that. That's much more narratively interesting. So our solution was to make Aaliyah not very strong, so that she could climb one mountain but she sure as hell couldn't climb two. What we found in practice was that it put too much physical peril on almost all the locations. We'd made this quite chill, quite ambient, quite relaxed game, and then suddenly she'd be like, oh, I'm asphyxiating, and we'd be like, okay, wait, we need to walk that back. But we had the code, so we saved it for a couple of locations. So there's a mountain at the end that you climb, or at the very beginning there's one location which is fairly small, which has a timer, which is not supposed to trip you up, but of course it trips somebody up, and then they complain bitterly about it, and that's fine. And then there's a really good bit where you go down a kind of ancient mine and find something that you really don't expect, and have a really significant, really profound conversation, which you then have to cut off because you've run out of air, which seems to me like an excellent narrative use for a device like that. But I still regret that it wasn't more integrated into the narrative, because I think partly, like obviously partly it's a poke in the eye at Lara Croft. Like we have this absurd computer game image of every archaeologist has to be able to jump across ravines, because otherwise you're not doing archaeology, and that's just silly. But also I like the idea of a protagonist who is physically limited, that the player will, because the player thinks, oh, I'm going to go here and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this, and then the reality is they can't, because their protagonist can't actually achieve it. And so how do they plan around that? That feels to me like a way of grounding you in the reality of the world. You've got to be a bit frustrated in a game world to feel you're really there. If you're completely in charge of everything, if there's no consequence and no cost, and there's nothing's tactile, nothing's physical, nothing's real, so you might as well just be a Roomba roaming around it, hoovering everything up. There has to be some kind of pressure, there has to be some frustration, and in most games that frustration is people shooting at you and falling off things, but all of that's quite silly. So in the real world, what are our frustrations? Well, we get hungry, we get tired, we run out of time, that kind of thing. So we were trying to kind of put something in that space. I think there's more to be done there in a design way. I think I'd be really interested in making games in which the protagonist, not where they're physically limited rather than physically empowered, and then sort of work with that. It also afforded a few things in the narrative rather nicely. Aaliyah was brought up in the slums. There's a world which kind of the slum world, the poor world, and then brought to the rich world. And by giving her this kind of illness as a result of where she came from, it means she's never allowed to forget where she comes from. She's always kind of in this beautiful rich world, but she's just not one of them. She's living in Beverly Hills, but she's not got the look, and so she can't leave that behind. And that helps to explain why the hell she does what she does, because I think one of the problems I had narratively is, why does this character go off on her own, like into these incredibly dangerous places to find these dead things that then she comes home and nobody gives a damn about? Like, that's pretty grueling. So she has to have some kind of thorn stuck quite deeply inside her to make that the right solution for her as a human being. Otherwise I just don't think she's believable. So that was useful to that. I think that's it. Yeah, that was kind of it. Like a lot of things in the game, because it really was kind of assembled over quite a long period of time. Things kind of, we had a lot of ideas, and the ones that stuck tended to be ones which had 4 or 5 different hooks into other things, so that you couldn't take them out again. And there were lots of ideas that we put in that kind of fell off again. So there's not often clear answers for things, but yeah, I hope that gets towards it a bit. What next? How successful was the game? Yeah, not as much as we'd hoped. Yeah, I don't want to dig into that too much, if that's all right. Next question was, what did you bring forward from your previous game 80 Days into Heaven's Vault, and are you bringing anything from archaeology into upcoming game Pendragon? We're making a game called Pendragon. It's about King Arthur. So we've been on a 10-year journey of making more and more responsive dynamic narratives. That's really kind of the core of what I'm interested in, is how can you make a story which still goes forward and has a beginning and middle and end, but adapts and evolves around what the player is doing as responsively as possible. And 80 Days did that quite a lot, but I think players feel like it's doing it more than it's actually doing it because of clever writing, which is fine and is a perfectly good solution. Heaven's Vault is a lot more genuinely responsive. It tracks a lot more. It pays a lot more attention to what you've said when, and what order you've said things, and what you believe and what you don't believe, which it has to, because whereas 80 Days, you basically you're going around the world, right? So once you're here, we know that you've done that bit and you haven't done that bit, and we always know that. So we've always got a time marker of where you are in your protagonist's journey in 80 Days. Heaven's Vault, you can play in any order, in any direction, and do anything you like, when you like. You can go to IOX 20 times or no times. So the dialogue has to be all available all the time, so the system can find the right thing to say. It can't rely on anything to simplify that problem. So Heaven's Vault is kind of more technically clever to solve that problem. Pendragon is even worse still in that it's assembled, it's a linear journey of kind of locations through Dark Age Britain, or Dark Age Britain, it's quite heavily stylized, but it's assembled on the fly by the machine every single time you play. It never plays the same game twice. It has lots of systems to try and make sure the content you see is always unique, and it never repeats itself. And hopefully you can play it as many times as you played 80 Days, but you'll always be finding new things and new corners and new pockets of information and new ways of doing things. And it's entirely built from an engine that's just grabbing content in a sensible way all the time, which has been a technical nightmare, but it does sort of work. Whether it's archaeological or not, no, I don't think it's even slightly archaeological. It's more interested in like hitting wolves with swords. Actually, it's really kind of a chess strategy game where the characters argue and fall in love and bicker and occasionally murder each other and that kind of thing while you're playing chess. So it goes back to that old fantasy motif of like the people having to be pawns on the chessboard, but like arguing while they play, which comes from somewhere or other. But it's quite fun. It's different again, really. I think after Pendragon, I want to do something really boring and linear that just goes in a straight line because I'm really fed up of all this technical stuff. But yeah. Do I know of any non-profit UK game studios? Not off the top of my head, no. I'm sure there are some. There's a lot of different funding models out there, but yeah, that's not, business development is not really my thing. Have I seen the board game Troy? Oh no, right, that's cool. Right, no, I haven't actually. I haven't. That's, yeah, I'm not surprised if I'd be surprised if we're the only game who's ever interacted with archaeology as a complicated thing. But no, I didn't know of any other games about archaeology actually at all. I knew a couple of games about translating languages, but most of them I felt they didn't let you figure out enough stuff on your own, so you couldn't take enough ownership of what you deciphered. So I felt like we could do that better. I think we did quite well in the end. Anything else? I'm happy. I'm in the mode now. I'm happy to talk about Heaven's Vault all day. Okay, cool. Do you mean it has 4 game parts, Troy 1 to 4, or do you mean it has the 4 cities of Troy because there were like 7 or something? I don't know. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think for me, the remark about ambiguity contrasting with game canon and stuff. Yeah, I get really tired of kind of game culture, which is all about nailing stuff and mastering stuff and having the correct version of stuff and all this. It's really tedious. So almost all of our games are designed to be pretty much impossible to optimize, and they go out of their way to stop you from being able to optimize them. So, you know, 80 Days is a game about traveling around the world, and it's absolutely full of places where you can go do something really efficient and sensible, but really boring, or do something interesting, which you know is going to waste a whole bunch of your money or a whole bunch of your time, but is going to have a joke in it. And the entire point of that is to do that enough that people think, oh, maybe I'll just have fun rather than win. And like, I feel like that's really important, to try and get people out of the mindset that the only way to be good at a game is to reduce it to its component elements, streamline it, beat it, and then discard it, because that's not how you enjoy things in the world. That's how you tidy them up, put them away, break them. But a lot of players are really interested in breaking stuff, which, you know, not for me.
Can I just make a quick comment about that? Which,
yeah, go for it.
One of the things I found most parallels is how we have to try to teach archaeology, because it's a similar style. Students want to learn facts. They want to learn what the right answers are.
Right. And
the hardest part about teaching archaeology to new students is getting them comfortable with the ambiguity or the equifinality of the questions. And some students really struggle with that. They really struggle. that there is 6 different answers and we don't really know. And some students really gravitate towards that, and they really enjoy the debate and the discourse around that. And so it does create a sort of polarizing issue on how comfortable you are with that. And that's not just true with students, that's true with dealing with other disciplines. When we deal with the more hard sciences, they can't stand that we don't know answers and that we're constantly debating things. And so it's a constant challenge, that ambiguity and equifinality. And that's what really struck me with your discussion is, it is, whether you know it or not, is such an integral part of archaeology and how we interact with it on a daily basis, on a teaching basis, even on a research basis. So
that's really great to hear. Actually, that's really affirming, because I think I grew up in a household with an anthropologist. I'm very used to high discourse subject matter, because anthropology doesn't even know what its questions are, let alone attempt any answers. But I think I also have, as I said, I have a maths degree, and obviously maths is obsessed with being this one subject in which there genuinely are truths and not truths, and process of finding truths. And I have a great affection for mathematics, but the one thing that it really showed me was that it's fundamentally not interesting for precisely that reason. It's quite fun, and if you can do it, it's perfectly relaxing, but it's hard to get really excited about it, because you can either do it or you can't, and it either is or it isn't, and that's it really. And my first job coming out of university was, I was a maths teacher, a high school maths teacher, and the kids used to ask me, what's the point of this? What's the point of trigonometry? Why are we doing this? And the answer was always, well, look, if you can think about this, if you can construct a mathematical solution here, then you stand a chance of being able to argue any more interesting, complex problem in the world, because at least you can get through a problem which has got an answer. So you might stand a chance in a problem which hasn't got an answer. Whereas if you can't even do this trigonometry triangle, and I apologize to anyone who's bad at maths, I was a very aggressive, bombastic maths teacher, that was my style, then you can't possibly hope to discuss anything more complex, because you're going to just fall to pieces immediately. And I found a certain joy in that line of argument. Whether it's true or not, or fair or not, is another matter. But yeah, I think that there's definitely that sense of realizing that things are up for discussion, and that's not anybody's fault. That's not things going wrong. That feels to me like something I've been learning in my transition from being a 20-year-old to being a 30-year-old to being a 40-year-old. It's part of growing up and realizing that no, really quite a lot more of this stuff is in flux than you gave credit for. Yeah, so I think that's good. I feel like that's an important mission to be on, and it's interesting doing that in the game space, because gamers are so committed to being right about stuff. They are so committed to that. They're even worse than science fiction fans, and science fiction fans are pretty bad. So yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, we just have to keep hurting them until they until they accept the lack of truth.
If I may, I mean, I really find fascinating the process you describe it. I'm a physicist myself, and I work in archaeological science, and I had to answer all these questions too. I mean, I had a lot of people actually asking me, okay, that's very nice, but what's useful for? I mean, what's the purpose of it? I mean, I had to answer these questions to myself, and actually reached extremely similar conclusions in following an extremely similar way. So I really find fascinating that I mean, I really love the philosophy that you have implemented in the game. But this idea about how archaeology is about constructing the narrative, and how important it's to know what happened to understand what we are, where we are now, and what are our options. History as a collective memory, understanding our collective past to understand our collectivity now, understanding that what happened before can happen again, and it's a choice. So it can change, it can be changed. These kind of things are the ones that make archaeology and humanities in general important. And it's something that I have to say we have in many aspects fail to communicate to the general public, who keeps asking why archaeology is important, and they end up with the easy question of, with the easy answer of because objects and value to the objects, and this kind of reflection on how important it is for us as human beings, as persons, as citizens, in the most wide sense of the words. But we have failed in many aspects to communicate that. And things like games are an extremely good way, I think, to actually transmit these complex issues in a way in which the public can understand them well.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable that the humanities has this branding of not being exciting, whereas at the same time, pretty much everyone is interested in history. Like pretty much everybody has a period of history which they don't know why they like it, but they like it. You know, whether they like the Romans or whether they like the Victorians or whatever. But everybody's got something that they just think speaks to them. And yet, if you ask them about the humanities more widely, they'll sort of say, well, you know, it's just people kind of arguing amongst themselves about petty details. And you're like, it's the stuff of it, right? It's the substance of it. But yeah, it's interesting.
By the way, it's the game going to PC?
Sorry?
It's the game going to PC?
To PC?
Yep.
Which one? Heaven's Vault?
Yep.
Yeah, it's on PC now.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. I'll drop a link.
Yeah, Mark, you don't know that.
I can share my Steam library with you. I have it.
Or you could buy another copy. I mean, it's one of the two.
Tested.
Yeah, no, it is. We talk about it as a PlayStation game mostly to make people pay attention to it, because PlayStation games are real games, whereas Steam is full of all sorts of nonsense. The reality is the PC version is the one that anyone actually in the world plays, because PlayStation gamers play FIFA and they play the driving one. That's what they play. Yeah.
Well, I actually wanted to just pull a thread. We are probably like very long beyond our limit, but yeah, it's okay. There is one feature of the game that actually you didn't comment too much, and from the perspective of archaeologists is actually very interesting. Maybe not so much in terms of like critical thinking, but actually it speaks a lot about what we normally do when you're like, after you dig, after you like analyze the artifacts, is the way that the protagonist actually builds the timeline and kind of assigns some kind of tags, no, about periods, about events and interpretations. And like this feature is actually very interesting because you see how knowledge can be built differently if you do like different things, you find different objects, no? So yeah, yeah, if you can, I don't know, maybe comment on that feature.
Yeah, so in the kind of the menu, the hub of Heaven's Vault, there's a map which kind of expands as you find things, and there's a timeline which gets dropped on with little markers to say what you've done in the story and also what you've discovered. And what you've discovered is partly like this site was founded, or so and so did such a thing about this date, or this object was made about now, or this object was carried from this place to this place about now. Or more broadly, it will say this period of time is called the Steel Empire, or this period of time is called the Age of Sail. And you start off with basically no knowledge of any periods of time, and then as you make discoveries, you kind of break it down into more and more kind of compartments of time. In terms of our process for that, we kind of always had this idea that we wanted you to record discoveries, but we didn't really know quite how to do it. And I think It's a funny one for me because we put all this stuff on the timeline, and in the end the timeline was a way of solving a design problem neatly, in that it lets you see that the decisions you made are permanent because they're on the timeline, and it lets you see what you've discovered about the past because that's on the timeline. And it was also a way of finding going back to look at old inscriptions to try translating them again, because you could put them on the timeline roughly where they came from. And so it was more of a kind of menu solution than a piece of kind of thinking, or even an attempt to really represent any true archaeological thing. And it was also really hard to build. It was really hard to build because it spans 5,000 years and you can zoom in on any given second, and numerically computers don't like that kind of thing. So by the time we'd got it built and working and started to actually use it and see what it was like, we pretty much had to finish the game. So one thing that I felt was that we never really managed to reflect on the questions that I would like to have reflected on, like how do people feel about adding things to the timeline? How do they use it? How do they explore it? What can they get out of it? What can't they get out of it? When is it too cryptic? When is it really clear? And to make that really relevant, because I like it when these things, I like it when the things in the game affect the way that the player thinks about the game, and then in turn affects the way the player acts in the game, because then they become real, right? So one thing that I think players don't do very much in Heaven's Vault is I don't think they go back to the timeline and browse through it to try and collect their thoughts and go, oh, I see it's like this. Like you might, if you were playing a detective game or something, you might go back to the evidence locker and kind of filter through it again. And I wanted people to do that. I wanted people to learn what was on their timeline by repeatedly looking at it, so that they had it in their head, so that it was relevant when they were exploring a place. So when it was contradicted, they were like, wait, I'm pretty sure this contradicts the thing. And we never quite got it to that state. And I'm not sure what we would have needed to do mechanically or design-wise to make it really feel really live. I think it's an element that a lot of people are interested when they start playing, and then they just sort of, it doesn't seem to do anything, so they just stop looking at it, which is I consider that to be quite a big fail, partly because it was quite hard to build. It took us a long time to build it, and if people don't look at it, then we just wasted all that time. And partly that I think there's something there that we didn't quite find. Oh well, I mean the game was so big and enormous that it kind of escaped us at some point. But like, yeah, I'd like to revisit that idea somehow, even if it was just something simple. Like I think I said earlier, I like the idea that when you finish the game, you look back at your timeline and it's full of contradictions. Like, I feel like that's a really important part of the game, and it helps people to understand the shape and structure of the narrative. And like when we get kind of reviews that say, oh, well, it doesn't really come together at the end, and I want to turn around and say, no, look, it doesn't come together at the end. Do you not see how great that is? Like, we worked really hard to make sure that it didn't come together at the end. Like, how can you? And that the time, yeah. Like if there'd been some way for the timeline to show that it was contradicting itself, but it just wasn't. It wasn't a smart enough piece of. The computer couldn't quite work out. I don't know. It was horrendous. I don't know quite what it should have been, but I feel like it wasn't quite right. Maybe the player didn't get to do enough of it. Like presumably as an archaeologist, you don't just pick up a brooch and say, this is a 15th century brooch made in 19. You actually have to position it. Maybe we should have had people positioning things on timelines and thereby interacting with it and learning it. But would that have got really very tedious very fast? I think it probably would have done. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, the thing that I actually loved about the timeline is probably what made kind of fail for most players is the fact that because you can zoom from the second, from the very last action that you did in the game up to the like almost mystical path in the nebula, you actually get this. It's like measuring distances in the solar system. So if you go realistic, it's completely like it's impossible to deal with, and people will not do it at all. So you actually need some kind of easy way to jump from those kind of different scales. But I actually love that feature because it's very common when people actually are thinking about the past, and especially for students, is that when you are thinking about it, you don't really relate to it in the same, like you're not imagining yourself in the same world that most of those things that you're studying actually happen. So it's kind of feels unreal at some point, no? If you're getting like, especially on deep past, no, like if you're studying prehistory, actually, it's very common that you're just studying the materials, but you kind of get lost because you don't really know much else about what is happening in the past. You don't really imagine it, so you don't really relate to it. So yeah, and the scale in the timeline is actually something that and the uncertainty that you put there is actually very
well. That's really good to hear. I mean, I'll pass that on to Joe. He built most of the scaling effects in the timeline, and that was definitely what we wanted. We wanted that continuity, that idea that the event that you did was a historical action, even though you did it 5 minutes ago, just in the same way as when this emperor killed this other emperor, that was also a historical action. And that they are of equal magnitude in a sense, like they were just done by a person at a time, because that feels to me like a core idea. Good. Well, I'm glad some of that came across, at least to people who are familiar with the idea anyway. Thank you. I think it reminded me of something which I was thinking about while writing it, when I guess I was thinking about the Egyptians or the Greeks or something like that, something in that kind of quite long ago, but not like horrendously long ago period. And when you work out how many generations it's been since the Greeks, the Egyptians, it's not nearly a large enough number at all, actually. When you think about it in terms of human lifespans, it's like, it's a couple of hundred or something like that. Yeah, it was terrifyingly small. And that idea that actually things, I think we compartmentalize ancient stuff as being way over there, and actually it's almost the opposite of the solar system. Like Mars is much further away than you think it is, whereas I think like ancient Rome is really much closer than you think it is, and so probably quite a lot more relevant actually, despite being quite a while ago. And then when you start applying it to more recent history that you don't exactly know when it happened, like one that comes up, I think, a lot in Britain is our relationship with India and the cessation of British rule in India, which was super recent, but everybody thinks it happened like 150, maybe 200 years ago, and it totally didn't. And that kind of thing. These scales are actually sometimes much smaller than people give them credit for. But again, I don't quite feel like we really managed to nail that point home quite as I would have liked. Yeah. Oh well. But yeah, it's definitely interesting. I think there's Tom, who's one of our core 4 people at Inkle, always says that he thinks there's another game just in the timeline. You can just play on the timeline. I think I'm not sure that he's right, but he certainly thought there was something there.
okay.
Anybody else?
No.
Okay. Well, maybe that's been a decent length of time. So thank you everyone. Thank you everybody for listening. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you. I'm just